Good afternoon. Thank you for taking the time to attend today. My name's Adrienne Neuenhuis, Commissioner at TEQSA, and I'm standing in for Dr. Mary Russell. For note, today's webinar will be recorded and made available on our website. I'll just move to the acknowledgement of country. TEQSA acknowledges the traditional owners of the country throughout Australia and their continuing connection to land, waters and community. We pay our respects to their cultures, country and elders past and present. Today's webinar will discuss generative artificial intelligence and TEQSA's approach to ensuring providers are mitigating the potential for this technology to undermine award integrity. Our intent is to give you the opportunity to ask questions about the upcoming request for information, which will be issued sector-wide in June and which our Chief Commissioner, Professor Peter Coldrake, recently wrote to you about. Please put your questions in the Q&A for our moderators to address. We will try to respond to as many questions as possible today, but following today's webinar, we'll update the FAQs on our website. As you'll be aware, our Higher Education Integrity Unit, led by Dr. Helen Gniel, is charged with identifying and responding to emerging risks to the integrity of higher education, such as generative AI. While generative AI is not new, over the last 18 months, as we've watched these tools rapidly become more available and more sophisticated in their capabilities, we've become concerned about the challenge these tools bring to ensuring students are achieving the learning outcomes in the qualifications in which they are enrolled. From a regulatory perspective, providers are expected to maintain ongoing compliance with the Higher Education Standard Framework. This includes obligations under Sections 1.4, Learning Outcomes and Assessment, and 5.2, Academic and Research Integrity. The request for information is about ensuring all institutions are engaging with the risk generative AI poses for assessment and award integrity and have a plan in place to mitigate that risk. I will now hand over to Dr. Helen Gniel, who will take you through the rationale behind the request for information, how TEQSA intends to use the information, as well as the timelines associated with the project. Thank you. Over to you, Helen.
Thanks, Adrienne. Thanks, everybody, for joining us this afternoon. We're really grateful that you've made the time to come today. I just wanted to place the RFI initially in the context of where we are on the timeline since ChatGPT launched. So I know that for some of the people at this webinar, they will have seen a slide like this before, but we also recognise that there's a lot of people at this webinar that haven't been to the previous webinars that TEQSA's offered on the generative AI topic. So ChatGPT launched not quite 18 months ago now, and in January last year, Chief Commissioner Peter Coldrake wrote to all providers to, make sure that they were on notice in thinking about what this meant for teaching, learning and assessment. We then moved to deliver a series of 5 webinars over the course of 2023, which were run in collaboration with Deakin University's Cradle. Those webinars are available as recordings on our website, and if you haven't watched them, I'd encourage you to go and have a look at them. They're a really fantastic resource. In April last year, we also launched the AI Good Practice Hub, and we've continued to update that resource. So again, if you've not yet looked at that, or if it's been a while since you visited that webpage, I'd encourage you to log on and review those resources again. What we heard over the course of last year repeatedly from providers was that they were really concerned about assessment, and they wanted some advice on how to think about assessment in the age of generative artificial intelligence. So in August last year, we convened an assessment expert forum where we had 17 of Australia's leading experts brought together to develop the document, the Principles for Assessment Reform in the Age of Artificial Intelligence. That first went out for public consultation in September, and the final document was released in November, along with a half-day workshop as part of the annual TEQSA conference. So this document has really benefited from that national consultation, and I want to acknowledge not just the 17 experts that led it, but also the additional 40 experts who reviewed it before it went to consultation, and then to everyone across the sector who took the time to read the document and give their feedback. every single one of those comments was carefully considered by the steering group of experts, and it's made it a much stronger document that really reflects sector feedback and concerns. So the principles for assessment reform contains 2 guiding principles, and there are then 5 things that sit underneath those. But I think the guiding principles are really important to reiterate again, because the first is that assessment and learning experiences equip students to participate ethically and actively in a society pervaded with AI. So this, I think, sends a really clear signal that this is not about banning AI. It's not feasible or desirable to try and ban AI technologies. And so when we talk about mitigating the risk, we're not saying that institutions should be completely shying away from these technologies. They are a tool, and they can be a very powerful tool. But the second principle is that forming trustworthy judgments about student learning in a time of AI requires multiple, inclusive and contextualised approaches to assessment. So now we find ourselves in March 2024. A letter from Peter Coldrake went to all providers earlier this month, and at the same time we launched the dedicated website on the TEQSA webpage that includes both a copy of that letter, but also a key considerations document and a frequently asked questions document. And that frequently asked questions document will be updated as we head towards the RFI submission date and probably beyond, with questions that we receive not just today, but also that come into our inbox over the course of those months. So today is the first of 2 webinars that we're running. There is an additional webinar on Monday which is aimed at professional accreditation bodies. We've heard from several providers that they really want TEQSA to work with the professions and to make it clear to the professional bodies what we're asking of providers. So if you're in an institution where you hold professional accreditation for some of your courses, we'd really encourage you to contact those professional accreditations agencies and make sure that they are aware of Monday's webinar and encourage them to attend. So the key considerations document that is on the webpage sets out the fact that while there's no fixed expectation about what form action plans will take, in general, TEQSA expects that the action plans take into account the breadth of a provider's offerings, including different locations and different modes of delivery, that they consider the requirements of professional accreditation where relevant, that the plans are actionable and have realistic timelines attached, and that the actions are able to be monitored and can have their efficacy assessed. We expect there to be information on how peak corporate and academic governance bodies are oversighting the risks and assuring quality, and also describe the mechanisms such as strategies, change management plans or steering groups that are or will be put in place to ensure long-term compliance. So over April and May, we will continue to update the frequently asked questions, as I said, both in response to what we get asked today, but also to any other queries that come in directly to us over those months. There will also be additional communication channels. So in April, TEQSA will be holding the first of its TEQSA Talks webinars, which will be an opportunity for the sector to receive updates on a range of issues, but that can also include generative artificial intelligence. There's also the TEQSA e-news that's released monthly, so I encourage you to subscribe to that if you're not already on that list. And then in June 2024, we will be issuing the request for information. That will be issued as a request through the provider portal, and the submission will also be through the provider portal a month later in early July. Over the course of July, August and September, we'll then be analysing those submissions with a view to identifying examples of best practice, examples that we might be able to use for case studies to develop resources that can help the entire sector transform in the way that we need to make sure that our higher education awards still have integrity in the age of generative artificial intelligence. So look, we just wanted to give you a quick overview and now really provide the opportunity for people to ask questions. I understand you can place your questions in the questions and answer. They'll be moderated and then asked of me.
Okay, so we'll begin with the first question. So you sort of addressed this a little bit, but I'd like a bit more detail. What happens if a provider can't change courses quickly because of the requirements of our accrediting body? What does this mean for our RFI action plan?
So I think it's really important to reiterate that what we're requesting is the plan. We're not expecting that people will be coming in July with a fully completed plan and have transformed all of their courses. I think that it would be a little suspicious if someone thought they could transform everything in that space of time. So we're looking for a plan. We're looking for people to have highlighted where they think they need to intersect with professional bodies or other bodies, and have a realistic timeline attached to when they can get through their suite of courses to deliver the transformation.
Okay, thank you. The next question sort of follows on a little bit. Can you provide some examples of things that we can include in our plans?
Look, I think we're very deliberately not providing a template. Australia has around 200 providers registered with TEQSA, and so they're really, really varied, and we really value and welcome that diversity, and we really welcome the diversity of thought we're going to get in the plans. It's part of why, you know, we're doing the project in this way, where we're issuing the request to make sure everyone's giving it consideration and that we're moving as a sector, but also that we can then look across that entire range and identify good examples and interesting and innovative thinking that will support the entire sector. So, you know, I'd refer people back to that key considerations document as showing you the kind of things we think that you'll be thinking about. But I don't want to limit people's creativity in addressing the problem.
Okay, so the next question, before I actually go on to the next question, can I just remind the audience, if you can please put your questions in the Q&A. The microphones are disabled, so we cannot take live questions. Thank you. Okay, the next question is, says, hi Helen, could you please confirm that you are planning of setting the RFI early in June and submissions with me due in early July?
Yes, that's correct. So Monday the 3rd of June, I believe it is the date the RFI will be issued, and 4 weeks later will be the due date.
Okay, a second question which could possibly lead into that is what will be the consequences if a provider doesn't submit their RFI on time? So
we're really keen to work with the sector in this process. It's a condition of registration that providers work with TEQSA when we're undertaking the kind of thematic reviews that we're doing in the case of the AI request. So obviously we have an expectation that all providers will engage with us and submit their action plans. Where people don't submit their action plans, we will be following up in the first instance to remind them and understand what the barriers are. But we're committed to collaboration, but also expect that providers are equally committed to collaborating with us.
Okay, another question here from one of the attendees. Is it possible to fail a plan? And if so, will we be given additional submission possibilities?
Yeah, I like this. It's when providers turn back to being students, and the next question will be about extensions and word limits. So look, we won't be grading them as such, but we're really keen to understand where in the sector support and resources are needed. So we will obviously be looking for examples of better practice. We'll be looking for case studies. We'll be looking for where we can see that providers are struggling, or for where we think that they would benefit from the resources that we're going to develop. I think, you know, similar to if a provider doesn't submit, if there is a plan that seems really, you know, not achievable for whatever reason, we would be working with that provider and following up with them. But I don't think there's a failing a plan as such. It's just about working out where we need to target our efforts to ensure that the entire sector is engaging with the risk.
Okay, the next question, you sort of touched upon a few elements, but this one is saying, will RFIs be used to judge the performance of individual providers, or is it purely a sector-wide information gathering exercise? In other words, what will TEQSA do if they think it is a poor action plan, which you've addressed a little bit already?
Yeah, I think obviously we're doing a thematic review because we're concerned about how this issue cuts across the whole sector. And if we were to see providers repeatedly refuse to submit a response, that would obviously give us cause for concern, and it would be open to us to then issue a statutory request to compel the information or to think what other actions we would take. I really feel from my interactions with the sector so far that the sector is really engaged with this, and they recognise that this is a risk that they hold. It's for providers to maintain compliance with the Higher Education Standards Framework at all time, which includes ensuring that awards are given out legitimately and that methods of assessment are capable of demonstrating achievement of learning outcomes. So I think providers understand that this is their risk to mitigate and that we're here to try and support them, and part of that is by engaging in this sector-wide assessment.
Okay, so here's another one from, given the breadth of what TEQSA is asking for, will require a significant overhaul of our institutional processes, which will require significant investment, and given the new visa rules implemented by the government, what concessions will TEQSA make to ensure your expectations are financially viable for small private providers?
I think in part my previous answer goes to this as well. This is really a self-assurance question. This is us asking the sector to tell us how you're assuring yourselves that you're continuing to award degrees legitimately. So I think that this is work that providers should and do have in train already. I know from speaking to the sector that there are some really interesting approaches that people have been taking to how they can consider the envelope they're spending on assessment at the moment and repurpose that funding in some ways to make sure they're doing different types of assessment that give them more validity and integrity in particular areas. So I think there's a lot of thinking that's going into this, and again, to reiterate, the risk is really one for the provider, and we're asking you to demonstrate to us how you're assuring yourselves that you're mitigating this risk.
Okay, this is just a quick question. So given this is an RFI, one of the questioners would just like a reminder of the timelines and also to know if there are any subsequent phases in this process. Yeah,
so again, and would encourage people to bookmark and make sure they know the web page on the TEQSA website, and I think Justine is probably dropping that into the chat where you'll find this information. So the RFI will be issued on the 3rd of June. It'll have a 4-week response time, so submissions will be due in early July. We anticipate that it will take 3 months for our team to analyse those. And in terms of then identifying case studies and developing resources, we'd be following up with those providers to gain permission and to work out the shape of those resources and then push out resources. At the same time, obviously, where there's providers who haven't submitted or where we think that we need a further conversation, that would be happening in that time. But just to reiterate, our intention is to have a non-statutory request at the moment, and we encourage providers to meet their obligations to cooperate with TEQSA while we undertake this for the benefit of the entire sector.
Okay, the next one says, our institution has done quite a bit of work on AI already. Is it possible for us to state our progress to date in the action plan? Otherwise, it may look a bit thin.
Yeah, absolutely. I think that will be fantastic. Institutions will be in different stages and phases with this work. We'd really encourage you to give us everything you think would be helpful for us and for the entire sector. So having an update on action plans, including, information on where things have proven trickier than expected or easier than expected. I think all of that feeds into a really rich information source that we can use to support our sector and transform at a national level.
Okay, here's another question, one that you've received a few times in the past. Is it possible for a provider to use AI tools to create their action plans?
I love this question. Yeah, of course, it's a tool. But ultimately, just as you would say to a student, you remain accountable for the quality of what you submit to TEQSA. So if you were to have AI just write an action plan and never review it and submit it, I think that would be problematic. But using it as a tool to help you construct a document that you ultimately take responsibility for and submit is fine.
Okay. How much detail would TEQSA like to see in a whole of institution plan? Indicative timelines, anticipated resources, and institution will put towards it, anticipated deliverables?
Yeah, I think all of those sound fantastic. That would be great. I think this is one of those, sort of chicken and egg situations, right? We haven't asked for something of this nature before. So like you, we're not exactly sure what we're going to get. But what we really want to see, as is put in the key considerations, is how you're assuring yourselves of those things across those domains. So things like modes of delivery, different locations, professional accreditation, thinking about, which of your courses have higher risk at the moment and which ones you might need to address first. Where you identify things like we really need a staff training module or we really think this is the best policy to change, we'd really welcome you including that in your plan because it really is going to benefit the entire sector to see that thinking.
Okay, so I encourage all the attendees to please put your questions in the Q&A, and in the meantime I will ask another question from our questions. So this one sort of links to some of the other questions you've had, but what happens if a provider doesn't submit an action plan at all?
I think if a provider repeatedly refused to engage in the process, we would obviously have concerns then, and that would probably lead to us using one of the other tools that we have in our suite of regulatory tools. So that could include a statutory request or a compliance investigation. I'm hoping it's very unlikely that anyone would fail to submit a plan at all.
Okay. Again, please put your questions in the Q&A. The microphones are disabled, so we can't ask live questions. So another question here. With the Universities Accord encouraging a shift to a more coherent tertiary sector, does TEQSA have any advice or thoughts on how RFI responses might consider Gen AI in higher ed and vet space?
I imagine for those providers that are dual sector, their institutional action plan is probably going to cover the entire post-secondary gamut, and we really welcome that thinking. I think that we will all benefit a lot from seeing how dual sector providers are conceptualising this risk across vocational and higher education courses. We don't expect providers that are dual sector to create a bespoke plan just for higher education. Similarly, where teaching, learning and assessment forms part of a broader institutional plan, again, you're very welcome to submit the broader plan and we can extract what we need for our purposes from that. So, I think the vocational question is really interesting and would really welcome seeing what providers are thinking about that.
Okay, this next question's sort of been answered already in various ways, but it seems to be repeated, so I'll ask it again. Will institutions be reviewed based on their stated action plans to ensure their plans are more than just a box-ticking exercise?
Yeah, absolutely. That's a really good question. I think the submission of the action plan does a few things, but one of the things it does do is set a baseline. This is about providers telling us how you are assuring yourselves, and so we expect that the action plan is a genuine one that you intend to follow through on, and so it does provide an opportunity then for review of that and for review of progress against the action plan. We don't currently have that a date for that in mind or a project step that includes that, but obviously we are expecting genuine, credible action plans that could be followed up on and that institutions would be able to show progress against, which is why in the key considerations document we say that we expect that action plans can be measurable and actionable.
Okay, so this question, it's kind of a statement but equally a question. There is a lot of mention of courses. I am also assuming that the RFI will include the HDR cohort, research only.
So this is a really great question. Research integrity is a really big topic. One of the webinars, I believe it was webinar 4 that we did in conjunction with Cradle last year, specifically looked at research integrity and specifically HDR programs. Especially where there is a course component as part of the higher degree by research, we're certainly expecting to see that is considered, and we would certainly be encouraging all providers that they should be thinking about what generative AI tools mean for research integrity and therefore what they mean for inducting HDR students into a culture of research integrity. So yes, we would love to see that included.
Okay, so this is a clarification question. It appears that the main focus of this RFI is on the integrity of courses and awards, and that information is not required on how the institution may deploy AI in other non-academic areas.
That's right. The focus of this RFI is about teaching, learning and assessment. Particularly in webinar 1, we did call out a lot of the other questions that we think institutions should be asking themselves, and we highlighted some of the ethical considerations in using these tools. So we certainly hope that institutions are turning their mind to that and thinking through the equity and ethical applications, privacy considerations, all of those in how they're using the tools, but that is not the focus of this request. This request is about understanding the impact on teaching, learning, assessment and how institutions are assuring themselves that they're awarding degrees legitimately.
Okay, so does this could be interesting. Does TEQSA have a view yet on which disciplines may be more at risk as per the RFI information?
No, I think again, it's really about self-assurance. We recognise that providers have a range of disciplines. They don't all teach the same kinds of disciplines, so that risk profile is going to look really different for every provider, and it's really about understanding how they're conceptualising the risk for their operations and how they're then assuring their corporate and academic governing bodies that they're mitigating that risk.
Okay, thank you. If anyone's got any questions, please put them in the Q&A. We cannot take live questions. So currently it seems like you're doing such a great job of answering these that people are running out of steam. So please put your questions in the Q&A. Again, please put them in the Q&A. We can't listen to people with raised hands if that's okay. Thank you. So here's another question. So after you receive the RFI, will you be providing any case studies or good practice examples for providers following the RFI?
Yes, so that is a really key objective of what we're hoping to achieve. So I guess, if we take a step back and look at the kind of public policy objectives here, we're trying to ensure that all providers are engaging with the risk. We're supporting providers to make sure that becomes a priority internally and that resourcing follows. And then we're trying to make sure that we identify where there needs to be uplift and where we need to provide support. It's one of the best things about working in TEQSA is that you get that bird's eye view across the entire sector. And so I know that we're going to see lots of really interesting examples coming from right across the sector, and our intention is then to identify those and develop case studies and examples to help everybody improve their course offerings.
Okay, I see that there's been a message put up that some attendees can't publish their questions because the Q&A is not appearing for them. Yeah. If you do have any questions, please email the integrity unit at teqsa.gov.au and we will answer your questions, not live today, but we will get back to you with your questions in the next week. Okay. Oh, hang on. I have just been given the sign of something. Okay. Currently, what are the most common practices institutions are using to mitigate the risk of AI?
Not a question I can answer, I'm afraid, because I haven't yet seen the submission. So I know that from talking to the various peak bodies that the peaks have been quite engaged in setting up working groups with their members. So I imagine that's probably the best place to find out what's happening at the moment. We haven't seen any action plans yet, so yeah, we're looking forward to that.
Okay, the next question is, will providers have the opportunity to update their RFIs based on TEQSA case studies post-July?
Yeah, we certainly think that providers will consider this an iterative process, partly because the technology is just moving so fast and things are changing so quickly. So we don't expect that a provider will submit an action plan and then be absolutely wedded to that, even if everything else changes. So, of course, providers can change their action plan. We just, again, expect that to be a process that has integrity and governance around it. So if you're modifying your action plan, you're keeping your corporate and academic governing bodies abreast of that and they're approving those changes. So there won't be a requirement necessarily to tell us every time you change your action plan where you think it's something really critical and where the sector could benefit from hearing about that change and what's driven it. We'd welcome it. But yeah, we recognise that this will have to be a living document for providers.
Okay, we've got a question here which kind of connects to the resourcing question earlier. So some institutions have less resources, yet we know assessment reform is going to be costly. Are there resourcing options being considered along with sharing of good practice ideas and good ideas and practice?
So TEQSA is not a funding agency, so that's not really a question I could answer. But I would say that I know that some institutions have been putting, significant thought into how they can repurpose the significant funds they're already spending on assessment. So this isn't necessarily about having to change everything. It's about, as the assessment principles reform document sets out, that there's meaningful and trustworthy judgments across the across the progression of somebody's course to make sure that at the point in which they graduate, you're confident that they've developed the skills, capabilities and attributes to be awarded that degree. So what that looks like and how institutions choose to repurpose assessment or put in additional assessment points with high validity and high integrity is really something that needs to be determined by the institution.
Okay, so there are two principles. One, educating about an AI future, and two, mitigating risk. Most of the discussion here seems to be about mitigating risk. Is TEQSA interested in the interesting ways providers are using AI across teaching and learning?
Most definitely. I mean, we're very, very interested, and we would, where providers want to show us those things, we'd be really keen to see them and to share those resources. A lot of what's on the AI Good Practice Hub at the moment is resources of those nature, where people are showing really interesting ways that they're incorporating the technology into their teaching and learning, and so we'd really welcome that. But you know, critically, what we want to ensure with this RFI is that providers are also mitigating the risk, that it's not just about the opportunities, and of course there are many, and providers will need to engage with these technologies for their own operations, as well as to ensure that students are graduating with the skills and knowledge they need to be effective users of these tools. And really welcome any examples that people want to give us. And you don't need to wait for the RFI. If you've got great examples, we can add those to the AI Good Practice Hub now, so please send them through.
Okay, another question. So in the RFI, what would be a realistic timeline that you could envisage providers to include in an actionable plan?
I think that's a really contextual and nuanced question, because providers are so different. There are providers that offer a very small number of courses. There are providers that offer hundreds of courses. So I don't think I can give you a number. I would certainly say that we're expecting action plans, you know, go over many months and maybe a couple of years, but we're also got to be realistic that we expect that all degrees are being awarded legitimately. And so, you know, if an action plan is going over 10 years, I think that would be concerning.
Okay. Okay, there was one participant who just asked if you can just reiterate the main reasons for the RFI. They asked for 2 main points. I'm not sure if you said 2 main points, but if you can reiterate.
So, I mean, I'm not sure if they're talking about... So the reason we're issuing the RFI is essentially to make sure that all providers are actively engaging with the risk that generative AI poses to assessment and the assurance of learning outcomes. We know, of course, that this work is in train in lots of providers, but we want to have that complete visibility that the entire sector has generated and is actioning a plan to ensure that they're awarding all of their qualifications legitimately. So that is really the purpose of the RFI. That's one purpose, but then we also recognise, of course, that providers can't do everything all at once everywhere. Providers will probably choose different points to start. Some of them will be already a fair way along the journey, and so by getting these action plans, it's going to allow us to identify good practice, to identify case studies, and then develop resources that will support the entire sector.
Okay, the next question is around Gen AI and cheating. Sorry, I'm just waiting for it to come up. The little blue circle is spinning. Okay, so TEQSA's responsibilities around contract cheating opens questions around whether the Higher Education Integrity Unit has evidence of Gen AI use in cheating organisations, and whether providers are likely to receive additional information around evidence of academic integrity breaches that might overlap or intersect with the RFI.
There's a lot to that question. So, I mean, it's a bit of a Venn diagram. So academic cheating and generative AI, of course, there is some overlap. And yes, we absolutely see evidence that contract cheating firms are offering to, 1, write your submission with generative AI, 2, to paraphrase using generative AI to make sure that it can't be picked up by AI detectors, and 3, you know, to probably lower the price of the service they're offering. So contract cheating definitely remains a threat. Generative AI feeds into that threat, but that doesn't mean all generative AI use is cheating. And, you know, as is clear in those 2 assessment principles, we do expect students to be developing skills, knowledge and capabilities in being an ethical user of these tools. workplaces are going to be using these tools, and there's going to be an expectation that graduates can use this technology. So, we want to avoid conflating cheating and generative AI. But we recognise that generative AI tools are capable of producing many of the assessment artefacts, essays, coding assignments, PowerPoint presentations, personal reflections. They're capable of producing those outputs with minimal engagement by the student. So, yes, it's a risk to academic integrity, and yes, contract cheating firms are using this technology as well, but they're not the same. So I guess I'd just caution that. We do share, intelligence back to the sector wherever we see a new and emerging threat. So if we saw something really specific that we thought the sector needed to be alerted about, we would put out a sector alert to share that knowledge.
Okay, so this is a question about TEQSA's engagement with the professional bodies. Are you able to give an indication of the professional bodies that have been approached to attend the webinar on Monday, and also what kind of advice would you give to accrediting bodies in regards to this RFI?
Yeah, thank you for that question. So we conducted a mapping exercise to identify all the professional accreditation bodies we could. So that includes those where professional accreditation is required to then practice in that profession, but it also included professional bodies where they endorse a course, but it's not a requirement to have that endorsement to then go on and work in that profession. So we've approached all the professional bodies that we were aware of and invited them to Monday's webinar, and the details of that are on our website and I think in the chat as well. So look, if you're working with a professional accreditation body, I would say just send it on rather than wondering about whether they were on our list. Hopefully they were, but it couldn't hurt for you to contact them directly as a provider. Essentially, I'll just be sharing the same sort of information with them and helping them understand what TEQSA's hoping to gain. So what is the risk that we're concerned about? What are we asking of providers? And how do we hope the professional accreditation bodies will work with their providers? The professional bodies are also going to be a really critical conduit because they know the profession. They know how the profession's moving and how these tools are being used, and so we're just really going to be letting them know about the RFI, that we are expecting the sector to submit these plans in July, and that will involve significant transformation potentially in some courses, and asking the professional bodies to engage with their providers to support that work. Okay,
so the next question kind of touches on the financial resourcing questions previously. So through this RFI collection phase, is there any anticipation of future funding or grants to facilitate this systematic adoption of AI tools by institutions?
No, I guess is the most simple answer. We're not a funding agency and we're not a grant awarding agency. So I'm afraid I can't help with that one.
Okay, so this question is about Gen AI use, appropriate or inappropriate. Are most institutions putting inappropriate Gen AI use in an assessment under plagiarism or another breach category?
I don't think I have an answer about exactly what institutions are doing at the moment. I haven't reviewed everyone's academic integrity policy to know what they're doing, and I think it's a very contextual, nuanced space. So lots of providers are nuancing it to the discipline. What's an appropriate use for this discipline, or even for this particular assessment task? It really comes back to what are you assessing with that task, and what is the appropriate use or not use of tools in that task, and how are you communicating that to students? So I don't think there is a straightforward, it should sit here and it should say exactly that. It's far more complex than that.
Okay, thank you. Another question here. It seems that a lot of the talk at the moment around Gen AI is around issues around academic integrity. However, what you've been suggesting today seems to suggest that providers need to be looking far more broadly. Is this correct?
Yeah, I would definitely say that's correct. We really actually have tried very hard to make sure that academic integrity is not the sole consideration. So it's definitely a consideration. But of course, there are much bigger questions that really go to the effective and ethical use of these tools for students who graduate. So it's broader. It's award integrity rather than academic integrity. And this RFI is specifically talking about award integrity. But of course, for institutions, they're going to be considering a far broader range of topics, particularly in how they implement these tools in their own business operations.
Okay. To the best of your knowledge, how have your regulatory counterparts in the UK, Canada and the US responded to the impacts of Gen AI and academic integrity in universities?
So I'd say it's quite varied. Not all countries have a single national regulator. We're quite lucky in that regard. So in some countries, I think in America, the United States, there's 112 different regulators of higher education. So I'm glad we're not dealing with that patchwork. So I couldn't answer for them. In Ireland, so QQI and TEQSA co-founded the Global Academic Integrity Network, and we continue to collaborate closely. They are currently running an assessment project where they are looking at interesting models of assessment that people are submitting as, I guess, case studies, for lack of a better word. This evening I'm on an OECD panel where there are various people from around the world talking about the approaches that their countries are taking, but I think partly because of the fact that TEQSA is a national regulator and because we have a centralised integrity unit and that we have a horizon scanning function, we saw this coming down the line earlier than other countries. So Peter Coldrake, our Chief Commissioner, first wrote out to all providers about generative AI 6 months before ChatGPT launched. At the time we called them digital writing tools. We didn't have that terminology, but I think we're ahead in terms of thinking about what it means purely because we saw it coming earlier than other jurisdictions. But the Global Academic Integrity Network now has 35 members from 31 different countries. And so, yeah, we talk all the time about what's the best approach. Everyone holds similar concerns about what it means for award integrity.
Okay, it seems like people are starting to run out of question steam, so if you've got a question, please put it in the Q&A chat. Otherwise, we'll wrap up shortly. In the meantime, perhaps I can ask another question. From your personal opinion, what are some of the, we've often talked about the risks, but what are some of the benefits you can imagine providers experiencing from doing this RFI and actionable plan?
The benefits of creating the plan itself, is
yes.
that the question? Well, I think it's pretty hard to push through any strategy without a plan, so I'm sure providers already have plans in place, but hopefully, really focusing that onto what generative AI tools mean for teaching, learning and assessment is going to assure themselves that they are mitigating that risk, but also that they're kind of future-proofing their courses. The tools will change, the technology will enhance, but if you're able to assure yourself that you have methods of assessment that are capable of ensuring that learning outcomes have been met, even with these technologies, then that's going to be some really excellent long-term thinking for your institution.
Okay, great. We've just had a couple more questions come in, so we'll ask this one and then one more, and then we'll wrap up. So this one's short and sweet, and it has been addressed, but one can always repeat. Is there a template or a model example of what goes into an RFI?
No. So we are deliberately not providing a template. We recognise the diversity of providers, and we genuinely welcome that diversity of thought. We're really looking forward to seeing all the different approaches that are being taken across the sector so that we can share those examples back to the sector. Okay, and our final question here. Beyond just concentrating on AI, how crucial is the role of programmatic assessment in the broader scope of this reform for institutions? Yeah, so in the Principles for Assessment Reform document, there is quite a bit of focus on programmatic assessment, because I think when we're talking about an age where you can no longer ensure the integrity of every single assessment item, it makes sense to think at that bigger level. So at the point when you're awarding a degree, what are the mechanisms that you've had in place across your suite of assessment tasks that lead you to be confident that that individual has demonstrated the learning outcomes to receive that degree? So I think a programmatic focus makes sense from that point of view, because it's about recognising that we're beyond the point where you can assume that every single assessment item has integrity. And I really commend some of the resources on our AI Good Practice Hub out of the University of Sydney in thinking about the two lanes. When is it assessment of learning for the institution to feel confident that the student is ready to graduate, and when is it assessment for learning, which is there as formative assessment to help the student understand where they are on their journey. And so I think trying to keep some of those principles in mind and think about across a program of study, what are we assessing, when, how are we ensuring that the student has met those learning outcomes is the critical piece.
Okay, we've had another question come in. So this one is, are there any unique considerations for a new higher education provider which have commenced operations within the past 3 to 6 months? How does this submission affect their first year review?
So that's a question I haven't had before, and I think I'm going to have to take that one on notice, but we will definitely talk to all the relevant teams within TEQSA and post a response to the frequently asked question page of our website.
Okay, and this is more of a personal opinion rather than a TEQSA regulatory one. Do you think there'll be more reward for AI than risks in regard to teaching and learning, and why?
Oh, that's a philosophical question. I think whether or not there'll be more rewards will probably depend on how effectively the risks are mitigated.
Okay, I'm not sure if this is within your wheelhouse, but let's give it a go. Learning designers are asking if there is any existing validated scale to measure low, medium to high risk to assessment.
Definitely not my expertise area, so again, I would encourage you to talk to the people and the experts within your own institution or your own networks who are doing this work, and it's probably a good time to remind everyone, although I've said it in a few places, you know, this is a risk that sits with providers, and we're just asking really as a self-assurance exercise for you to demonstrate how you're assuring yourselves that students are receiving their degrees legitimately.
Okay, thank you everyone for your questions. I think that's it for now, so I guess we can wrap up.
Thanks everybody. Thank you so much for taking the time. We really appreciate all the questions and all the thought that's going into this. We're really excited to see the submissions, and you can see the email address there on the screen. If you have more questions, please send them through and we will update our frequently asked question page. Thanks very much for coming.